The auction hall was quiet, the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it is waiting to see a woman lose. 90-odd people had crowded into the old Grange building on the last Thursday of that long, dry August, and the ceiling fans turned overhead without moving the air, only stirring the heat around like a spoon in warm broth. At the front, behind a folding table stacked with deed maps and coffee ring papers, stood a woman named Delia Marsh, 41 years old, in a faded canvas jacket that had cost her nothing and earned her everything. And she was holding a single sheet of paper that would decide whether the whole valley kept its water that autumn or lost it to a man in a pressed gray suit. The man was named Curtis Vane, and he had come from the consortium up in the city with a briefcase and a smile that he wore the way other men wore a good hat, and he was watching Delia the way a card player watches a hand he is sure he has already won. Everyone in that room believed the verdict was still to come. But the verdict had been passed long before, out on 74 overgrown acres nobody wanted, passed not by any of them, but by the land itself, which remembers what people forget. To understand why Delia Marsh stood at that table holding all their fates in her calloused hand, you have to go back 3 years, to the morning she first drove up the rutted lane to a farm the county could not give away. It was March then, cold and mean, and Delia had a truck that ran on faith and a bank envelope with everything she owned inside it, which was $11,000 in change. Her husband had been gone 2 years by then, taken by the same illness that had eaten most of what they'd saved, and she had come out of the city with a settled quiet in her that people mistook for weakness. She was looking for cheap land, because cheap land was all she could buy, and the county tax office had a parcel that had failed to sell at 3 consecutive auctions. 74 acres, they told her, foreclosed on a decade back, gone wild since. Ridge and hollow. No cleared pasture left, choked wall to wall with multiflora rose and greenbrier and cedar and poison ivy grown thick as a man's wrist. Blackberry canes over a body's head, the whole of it a bramble so dense you could not walk into it, only around it. There had been a homestead up on the bench of the hill once, they said, but nobody had laid eyes on the ruins in years, because you couldn't get through the growth to reach them. The reserve price had dropped and dropped until it sat at $9,000, and still no farmer would touch it, because to clear 74 acres of that would cost more in machinery and hired labor and burned diesel than the land would ever be worth. Delia bought it for $9,000. She stood at the edge of that green wall of thorns, with her deed folded in her jacket and $2,000 left to her name, and she did the arithmetic that would rule her life for 3 years. $9,000 for the land, $2,000 to live on, nothing for machines, nothing for men to swing brush hooks, nothing for anything but her own 2 hands and whatever else was cheap. She looked at that impassable green and understood she had bought a debt that wore the mask of a farm. The town called it Marsh's Folly before she had spent a single night there. Word travels fast in a valley, and the word was that a widow woman from the city had thrown away $9,000 on a parcel that had beaten 3 generations of better men. She went down to the feed store in the little crossroads town of Halford's Mill for wire and staples and a bag of nails, and the men, leaning against the counter, stopped their talk when she came in and started it again louder when she left. She heard the phrase through the screen door, the phrase they'd hung on her already. A woman alone, said the way you'd say, a lame horse or a cracked axle. A thing that could not be expected to amount to anything. She did not turn around. She had learned that being right is its own kind of reply, and that you did not have to win an argument you refused to have. But she carried the phrase home with her, and it sat in her chest like a swallowed stone, and she did not yet know that 3 years on she would take that same phrase and turn it inside out and hand it back to the whole valley clean. The first weeks nearly finished her. She lived in the truck, and then in a tent, and then in a lean-to she nailed together from pallet wood, and she went at the brush with loppers, and a machete, and a mattock, and the land ate her effort, the way the sea eats a thrown stone. In a full day of bleeding, cursing, labor, tearing at thorns until her forearms looked like she'd fought a bobcat, She could clear perhaps a strip the size of a bedsheet, and by the next morning she'd swear the greenbrier had grown back what she'd taken. She did the arithmetic again, and it was pitiless. 74 acres. At a bedsheet a day it would take her something past 1,000 years, and she had by then about $600. She sat on a stump one gray evening with her hands so cramped she could not open them all the way, and she came as close to weeping and quitting as she ever came. And it was then, in the last blue light, that she heard the small sound that turned her. It came from the neighbor's fenceling, a bleating, and she walked over stiff-legged and looked to the wire, and there, in the failing light, stood a scruff of goats belonging to the old man next door, and they were not eating grass. They were up on their hind legs against a bank of the very same multiflora rose that was defeating her, stripping the leaves and biting the canes, working at the thorns with a contentment that looked almost like insult. Delia stood there a long time, watching those goats eat the exact green misery that had bested her all through March, and something in the arithmetic shifted, though she could not yet have said the sum. She only knew that the land had whispered something to her through the mouths of those animals, and that if she was going to survive out here, she had better learn to listen. The old man's name was Emil Sorensen, and he was near 80 and had come from the old country as a boy, and the valley half respected him and half was wary of him the way people are wary of anyone who keeps his own counsel and does not need them. He found Delia at his fence the next morning, and he did not laugh at her the way the town had. He looked at her torn arms and then out at the wall of green on her side, and he leaned on his stick and said, in that soft accent that turned his sentences into something older than they were, that she was fighting the land like it was an enemy, and the land was never an enemy, only a stranger she had not been introduced to yet. Then he said, the thing she would carry the rest of her days, said it looking not at her, but out at the thorns as if reading them. The land keeps a longer memory than any of us, and it will forgive nearly everything, but it only ever tells you its secrets in a whisper, so a body that means to farm must learn first how to be quiet enough to hear. And then plainly, as if it were nothing at all, he told her to stop cutting the brush. Cutting only makes it angry, he said. It grows back twice for every cut. But there is one thing that Green Army cannot fight, and that is a hungry mouth that likes the taste of thorns. Buy goats, he told her. Not a few. A herd. And let them do the war you cannot win. She had $600. That was the whole of the arithmetic. Emil watched her do the sum in her face. And then he did a thing that told her more about the man than any speech could. He said he had 40 head more than his old bones could tend, and he was tired, and he would sell her 32 of them for $400 and take the rest of the payment in help through the year. And she could pay the balance when the land started paying her. She said she did not take charity. He said this was not charity. This was two tired creatures making a trade, and besides, he said, and here the old eyes crinkled, he wanted to see if the land remembered how to be a farm, and he did not think he had years enough left to wait on doing it himself. So Delia Marsh bought 32 goats for $400, which left her $200 to her name, and she drove them up her rutted lane in a borrowed stock trailer, and she turned them loose against the green wall that had beaten every better-funded man in the county, and she stood back to watch what a hungry mouth could do to a war she could not win. What the goats did, they did slowly, which is the only way the land ever does anything worth trusting. The first week you could hardly see a change, only a fringe of nibbled canes along the edges where the animals had started in, and the town, when word got round that the Folly woman had answered $9,000 of bad land with $400 of scrub goats, laughed the way it had been waiting to laugh. But Delia was not watching the town. She was watching the herd, and she was learning them the way Emil had told her to learn the land quietly until she knew them. There was a big buck she came to call the judge, a heavy gray animal with a white blaze and a stillness about him that the whole herd steered by. Where the judge went, they followed, and where he settled, the rest settled, and Delia found that if she could coax the judge to a new patch of thorns, the entire herd would follow him into it. There was a wily old nanny she called Trouble, who could get out of any fence God ever made, and a set of twin kids born that first April that a quiet boy would later name for her. She built her cheap fences of a single strand of electric wire and moved them by hand every few days, penning the goats in a fresh strip of the worst of the growth and letting them eat it to the ground and beyond, down into the very crowns of the multiflora rows, and then moving them on. Emile had given her the key, and the key was this. Goats do not graze like cattle, low and level. They browse high and hungry, and they crave exactly the woody thorn trash that ruins a pasture for every other animal. She was not fighting the land anymore. She had introduced herself to it and set it to eating its own worst enemy. By that first summer, she had a helper she had not asked for. He came from the Pruitt place down the road, a family that had more children than luck, a thin, watchful boy of 10 named Wesley, who never said much and missed nothing. He drifted up her lane one hot day and stood at the fence watching the goats work. And he did not laugh, and he did not ask the questions grown men ask. He only watched, and after a while he asked if he could help move the wire. And Delia, who had been alone with her arithmetic and her animals for months, found her throat tight when she said yes. Wesley came most days after that. He named the twin kids Salt and Pepper, and gave names to a dozen others, and he had a gift for reading, which goats were off their feed, and which fence post was about to fail, and he became, without either of them ever saying so, proof that at least one soul in the valley saw the sense in what she was doing. He would sit on the tailgate at dusk and eat the sandwiches she made and ask her, in his blunt way, why the men in town called her place a folly when the thorns were plainly going away. She told him that people laugh loudest at what they have already given up on, because a fool who succeeds makes wise men feel like they quit too soon. Wesley chewed on that for a week and then said one evening that he did not think she was a fool. And that was the whole of his speech, and it meant more to her than any of it. And then, near the end of that first summer, up on the bench of the hill where the old homestead was supposed to be, the goats ate their way through to a secret. Delia had moved the wire steadily up the slope through July, and the herd had opened the ground like a slow green tide going out, revealing beneath the cleared thorns the shape of things long buried. The flat stones of an old dooryard, the sunken line of a lane, the rotted sills of a house gone back to earth. And one August evening, following the judge up to where the herd had bedded, Delia pushed through the last screen of eaten-down cedar and stood in a small clearing the goats had made, and there before her, blackened and mossy and near swallowed by 50 years of growth, stood an old rock chimney. 4 courses of hand-laid fieldstone rising up alone out of the ruin of a house that had otherwise gone entirely to nothing. It stood there like a headstone for a farm, and Delia put her hand on the cool stones of it in the last light and felt the old fireplace opening at its base, and she understood that some family, 100 years back, had cleared this very ground with sweat and fire, and had lived here and warmed themselves at this hearth, and the land had taken it all back into itself, patient as always, and now was giving it up again to a woman alone and 32 goats. She stood a long while at that chimney. And she did not yet know it, but the reason that chimney mattered, the reason the whole valley would one day hang on it, was hidden a few feet down in the ground beneath the old hearthstones, banked and waiting like a coal kept low under ash. And it would be 3 more years before the drought came, and the digging began that would bring it into the light. The second year the land began, quietly, to pay her back. Where the goats had eaten the thorns to the ground the summer before, grass came up in the spring, timothy and orchard, grass and clover whose seed had lain dormant in that soil for a decade under the smothering brush, waiting, the way the land waits, for someone to let the sun back down to it. Delia had not planted a single seed. She had only removed the thing that kept the meadow from being a meadow. And the meadow had remembered how to be one. By that second summer she had close to 20 acres opened up into rough green pasture that ran from the road up toward the old chimney on the bench, and the goats, having eaten themselves out of a job on that ground, had bred up to a herd of near 60, and Delia was moving her wire across grass now, instead of brambles. She began to sell kids in the spring and cull bucks in the fall, and the arithmetic, which had been 1,000 years of bed sheets, had become something a person could almost live on. She patched the lean-to into a cabin. She paid Emil the last of what she owed him, and he waved it off, and took it anyway, because he said a debt paid was a friendship kept clean. And she kept the chimney and its clearing to herself, and told no one what she suspected of it, banking her small growing success the way you bank a coal low and hidden, so that the town still called it Marsh's Folly, and still said, over the feed store counter, a woman alone, and still did not trouble to drive up her lane to see that the green wall was gone. The outside validator came in the 3rd spring, and he came, as they always do, from beyond the valley, judging her by the only thing they had never bothered to judge her by, which was quality. He was a chef named Nardo, who had opened a restaurant 2 counties over, and driven the back roads looking for a supplier of the thing city menus had lately gone mad for, which was clean, pasture-raised goat chevon, meat from animals that had browsed wild forage instead of standing in a feedlot. He'd heard from a livestock hauler that some woman up Halford's Millway was running goats on wild ground, and he found Delia's lane and drove up it, and he stood a long time in her open green pasture looking at animals that had spent their whole lives eating rose canes and cedar and wild forage on a clean hillside, and he tasted at her table. A cut she cooked for him, and he named her a price per head that made her sit down. He wanted all she could raise. He wanted more than she could raise. He paid her, that first season, more than 4 times what the sale barn would have given, and he told the other chefs. And by that summer, Delia Marsh had a waiting list and a reputation 2 counties wide that had not yet reached a feed store 6 miles from her door. The valley still thought she was scraping by on a folly. Beyond the valley, they knew better. And that gap between what the near people believed and what the far people knew was the space in which Delia quietly, without ever raising her voice, became the most successful farmer in the county. It was that 3rd summer that the smooth man first came up her lane. Curtis Fane drove a clean gray car and wore a suit no farmer owned, and he represented, he said, a consortium of investors who were assembling land in the valley for a development, and he had done his homework. And he knew, he said with a warmth that did not reach his eyes, that a woman on her own out here must find 74 acres a terrible burden. Nupple must lie awake with the worry of it. He would take that burden off her. He named a figure, $42,000, and he framed it as a kindness, as a rescue, as more than a place like this could ever be worth. Delia listened to him the way she had learned to listen to the land, quietly, until she had heard the whole of it. And then she told him plainly that the land was not for sale. He smiled and left his card and said the offer stood, and she watched his clean car go back down her rutted lane, and she felt the first cold touch of a thing she had not felt from the honest scorn of the town. The town's laughter had never wanted anything from her. Oranins, this man wanted everything, and he had smiled while he asked for it, and she understood, standing there with his card in her hand, that a smile that wants your land is a more dangerous thing than a laugh that only wants to feel better than you. She did not know yet why a development consortium wanted 74 acres of old goat pasture at 4 times its worth. She would learn. It was the same reason she had begun that dry spring to dig around the base of the old rock chimney on the bench of the hill, because the water had begun to fail. That 3rd year, the rains that should have come in April did not come, and the ones in May did not come. And by June, the valley had gone into a drought the old men said they had not seen the equal of in 50 years. It came on like the open door of a furnace, the heat standing over the county day after day, with no cloud to break it, and the creeks that fed the valley farms dropped and stilled, and finally some of them stopped. Wells went dry. The big cattle operations that had laughed loudest at the goat woman began hauling water in tanks at ruinous cost, and the corn stood stunted and pale, and the pastures burned brown, and the whole valley began the slow, terrible arithmetic of a drought, which is the arithmetic of how long you can last before you sell your herd for nothing or watch it die. And it was in this heat, digging one evening at the base of the old chimney to set a proper hearthstone for a fire ring, that Delia had struck 3 feet down beside the old buried footing, a seep of cold, clean water welling up out of the fieldstone, and had understood at last why a family had built here 100 years ago, and why a chimney had stood alone through 50 years of neglect. They had built over a spring. The homestead's old spring, capped and buried and forgotten under half a century of brush, a strong, cold, artesian seep that ran, she would find when she dug it properly out, at better than 4 gallons a minute, in the worst of that drought. More than 4 gallons a minute of clean water rising up out of the ground on the bench of the hill, while all around the valley the creeks lay dead and the wells sucked air. She stood over that seep in the failing furnace heat of that evening with the water cold around her wrist, and she understood exactly what she was holding, and she banked it low and quiet under the ash of her own reputation as a folly, and told no one but Emil and the boy. Emil came up the hill to see it, leaning on his stick, and he knelt at the seep and put his old hand in the water, and was quiet a long time. And then he said the land had kept this the whole while, kept it patient under the brush, waiting for someone quiet enough to hear it, and that this was the whole of farming in one thing. The land remembers what the people forget. And it whispers always, it only whispers, and a valley full of men shouting at their dry creeks would never in 100 years hear a spring whisper under an old chimney. He looked at her with something grave in his face, and he said she must think carefully now, because a spring in a drought was not water. It was power, and power drew men like Vane the way a carcass draws crows, and she had better decide what kind of steward she meant to be before the valley came up her lane on its knees. Delia asked him how Vane could possibly know, and Emil only shook his head. But she would find out how Vane knew, and the knowing would be the ruin of him. Vane came back in July, and his warmth had grown thin. The offer had climbed to 60,000, and there was an edge under it now. He talked of the development, of how her holdout was standing in the way of progress for the whole valley, of how a consortium with the county's ear could have a parcel condemned for a public water project if the owner proved unreasonable. And he said the word unreasonable the way the man at the feed store had said a woman alone, a small blade wrapped in courtesy. And he made his mistake there, standing in her dooryard in the killing heat, because in pressing her he let slip more than he meant to. He spoke of her spring on the bench of the hill as an asset the consortium had valued, and he named its flow better than 4 gallons a minute, a figure Delia had measured herself and spoken aloud to exactly 2 living souls, an old man and a 10-year-old boy, neither of whom would have carried it to a man in a gray suit. She said nothing. She let the number sit in the air between them, and she watched him realize, a half-second too late, that he had shown her his hand. He had known about the spring before she offered it to a single buyer. He had been up on her land, or paid someone who had, spying it out and measuring it, which was how a city consortium had come to want 74 acres of goat pasture at 4 times its worth. Not for houses at all, but for the one strong spring in a valley they had already known was going dry. Water. They meant to bottle and pipe and sell back to the very county that was dying of thirst. Delia looked at Curtis Vane a long moment, and then she told him plainly, in a single quiet sentence, that he should get off her land and take his measurements with him. He went. But he did not go for good, and she knew it. He went to the county. The humbled beggar came before Vane's next move, and he came in the person of the man who had laughed loudest of all. His name was Hollis Renfrew, and he ran the biggest cattle operation in the valley, 300 head on 1,100 acres. And he had been the one, 3 years back, to hang the name Marsh's Folly on her and make it stick. the one at the feed store counter with a woman alone in his mouth. The drought had ruined him worst of anyone, because he had the most to lose and the deepest thirst to slake. His creek was dead, his one well was down to mud, and 300 cattle drink a great deal of water a day. He came up her lane in a truck white with dust, and he stood in her dooryard with his hat in his two hands. And it cost him, you could see it cost him everything he had, to say what he had come to say. He had heard he said that she had water. He did not have the money to pay what water was worth in a drought, not with his herd worth half what it had been, but he was asking. He said, and his voice broke on the word, he was asking her to let him haul from her spring to keep his animals alive, and he knew, he said, looking at his boots, that he had no right in the world to ask her anything. And Delia Marsh, who had every reason under that furnace sun to name him a price that would take his 1,100 acres in payment, who could have gouged the man who had made her a laughingstock and no soul in the county would have blamed her, stood quiet a moment and then told him to bring his tanks in the morning and to take what his cattle needed, and that they would settle the cost when the rains came, and not before. Hollis Renfrew stood there and could not speak. Then he put his hat back on and got in his dusty truck, and that was the beginning of the reversal, though the reckoning had not yet come. It came at the Grange Hall on the last Thursday of August, the day this story began, and now you know how Delia Marsh came to be standing at that folding table holding a single sheet of paper, while 90 people waited to see her lose. Curtis Vane had gone to the county with a proposal dressed as salvation. The consortium would develop a valley-wide water system drawing on the spring up on the bench of the hill, and would sell water to the drought-stricken farms at what he called a fair market rate. And all the county need do was use its authority to secure access to that one strong spring on a certain unreasonable landowner's property. He had called the public meeting himself, confident, because he held the water and he held the county's fear. And fear is the easiest thing in the world to sell to. He had not counted on Delia coming. She had not spoken 3 sentences in public in 3 years. But she came, and she asked to be heard, and the room went quiet. The way it goes quiet when it is waiting for a woman to lose, and she stood at the table and set down her single sheet of paper, and she spoke in the plain, quiet voice she used on skittish goats and frightened men. She said the spring was hers on her deeded land, and that no consortium had measured its flow with her leave, and she asked Curtis Vane before the whole room how it was that his proposal to the county named that spring's flow at better than 4 gallons a minute, when she had spoken that number aloud to exactly 2 people in 3 years, and given it to no buyer at all. And there it was, the too precise figure, the miscounted card laid face up on the table. And Vane, caught, did the thing that cornered smooth men do, which was talk too fast, and in his talking he confirmed for every ear in that room that he had had men on her land without her knowing, and that the consortium had meant all along not to save the valley, but to own its thirst and sell it back. The warmth went out of the room toward him like heat out of a stone at nightfall. And then Delia said the thing she had come to say. She said the spring was not for sale, not to the consortium, not at any price, because a thing the land had kept for 100 years to give in a time of need was not a thing a person had any business selling for profit in exactly that time of need. But, she said, and here the room leaned in, any farm in this valley whose animals were dying of thirst could haul water from her spring starting the next morning, and she would charge them not 1 cent for the water itself, because the water was the land's gift and not hers to sell, and she would ask only a fair wage for the labor and the pipe and the wear of it, the same rate a man would pay a neighbor for an honest day's help, so that no one need take charity and no one need go dry. She had done that arithmetic too. It came to almost nothing, and it saved them all. The tide of that room turned in the space of a breath, the way the land does everything, all at once after a long, slow gathering. Hollis Renfrew stood up first, the loudest early mocker, and took off his hat and said in a voice thick with shame and something better than shame, that this woman's goats and this woman's water had done more for the valley than all his 300 head and 1,100 acres, and that any man who called her place a folly again would answer to him. And one after another, the men who had laughed at the feed store took off their hats, and the phrase that had followed her for 3 years, a woman alone, died right there in that hot room. Because she was not alone, she never had been, she was the one they all now stood behind. Curtis Vane gathered his papers and his briefcase and left in the contempt of 90 people, defeated not by any weapon, but by plain decency, which is the only thing his kind never planned for and never can answer. He was gone from the valley by the next week. His consortium scheme dead the moment the county understood what it had nearly done. The rains came in September, as they always do come, late and grudging, and then all at once, and the creeks filled and the wells rose and the burned pastures greened, and the land, patient as ever, forgave the valley for a season of thirst. Delia Marsh's spring ran on through it all, and runs yet, and the water she gave in the drought was never charged for, only the labor, exactly as she'd said. She married her herd, near 200 head now, to a reputation that ran 4 counties wide, and she raised the old rock chimney back up with mortar, and set a real hearth at its foot, beside the spring she'd found there. And she built her cabin into a house looking out over 74 acres of clean green pasture, where a green wall of thorns had once beaten every better-funded man in the county. Wesley Pruitt is grown now, and runs the far half of the herd, and still calls the twin goats' descendants Salt and Pepper, generation after generation. And old Emil Sorensen came up the hill one last autumn evening before he passed, and sat with her at the fire at the foot of the raised chimney with the spring, whispering cold in the dark, beside them. And he looked out at the pasture the goats had made, and the water the land had kept, and he said, in that soft, old country cadence, that he had wondered whether the land still remembered how to be a farm, and now he knew it had only been waiting, all those years under the brush, for someone quiet enough to hear it whisper. "The land remembers what we forget," he said, "and it forgives nearly everything, and it gives its best gifts only to the ones patient enough to earn them." Then he was quiet, and they watched the fire, and out in the dark the herd bedded down, around the old chimney on ground that a family had cleared with sweat 100 years before, and that a woman alone had cleared again with nothing but patience, and a hungry mouth for thorns, and the spring ran on beneath them, cold and steady the way it always had, the way it would long after all of them were gone.
Vraiment y arriver. Oui, tu vas être fatigué, mais il va falloir t'y tenir. Oui, tu vas être fatigué. J'ai 40 ans, j'ai une fille, une maison, un travail. Je suis éclatée. Mais je me suis donné un objectif, c'est que en septembre, ça va devenir mon métier. Donc je fais des concessions. Oui, oui, je suis fatiguée. Mais quel entrepreneur n'est pas fatigué aujourd'hui? Hein? Voilà. C'est très dur d'être sur les réseaux, de publier régulièrement, même si on publie une fois par jour. Oui, oui, oui. Ah bah oui, c'est compliqué. Bien sûr que ça l'est, Flavie. Mais on n'a jamais dit que c'était facile. Il faut absolument être partout. Je suis désolée, j'essaye de lire vos messages en même temps. Moins on te voit, moins tu gagneras. C'est tout à fait ça, Nika. Alors c'est pour ça, hein. Là, je bombarde, de clips sur TikTok. Mais pourquoi? Je sais que c'est relou pour ceux qui qui voient tous les clips que je poste, mais parce que tu postes 3 clips dans la journée.